Hello and welcome to another episode of Leaders of Transformation. Today we're going to talk about an interesting topic, maybe a little tricky, a little touchy, the subject of finances and cleaning up your accounting mess. Our guest today is a CPA, and he has spent many, many years cleaning up the financial messes of companies, and very quickly began to see that the problems that drained into that, as he calls it, the accounting sewer, were merely symptoms of a much larger dysfunction within the organization. And so what we're going to talk about today is what's the root cause to that. And so our guest is Alex Vorobieff, and I practiced that last name several times, so we got it right. Woohoo! Alex, welcome to the Leaders of Transformation. We're excited that you're here today.
Well, it's great to be on, Nicole. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And a shout out to Interview Valet. Man, those guys and ladies send me amazing, amazing guests. Tom and Karen Schwab are fantastic. They have an amazing team. And so they introduced me to Alex. So shout out to them once again for a great introduction. And for those of you listening, really do appreciate you being here, because the reason why we do this podcast is to inspire you, to equip you, to give you the tools you need to be the leader of transformation that you're capable of being. And so I encourage you afterwards, go to theleadersoftrandsformation.com. You can reach out to us there or find us on social media and let us know how this has impacted you. If you have questions, if you have comments, we love to hear from you. Also love to hear your stories about how you're making an impact in the world. So I encourage you to reach out to us. There's also really great resources on the website available to you, whether it's all the other guests that we've had on the show, whether it's I know Alex has got some really great resources that we're going to talk about, his podcast, his magazine. All of that is going to be available for you in the show notes. So highly encourage you to take advantage of that's there for you. So with that, I'd like to just dive right in and, as I said, get into that messy accounting sewer and see how we can make things work. So Alex, let's start off with, the mess. You talk about the mess and what you discovered. So maybe give us a little bit of a backstory to how you actually discovered this dysfunction that was a much greater issue.
Well, thanks, Nicole. What I'd find was when I go into a company, and oftentimes they'd outgrow the person who was doing their accounting, be it a controller, or sometimes they had the CFO title, or they just didn't have a title at all. And the company seemed to be backing up in accounting. Couldn't get the invoices out, maybe you're not collecting, can't get financial statements until weeks or months after a period ended. And you talk to the person doing the accounting, and they were overloaded. They're like, it's not doing the financial statements a hard time. It's getting the information and cleaning it and getting it right and talking to people and figuring out what they did and how to account for it. And what happens is a business is, once it's more than one person, it's a team sport, and it's coordinating efforts. And people can do things in the field that they can just do it and it's expedient. But it's not until someone's trying to account for every decision, essentially, that it really shows up in the accounting. Because if they decided to do something one way over here and another managers doing the same thing, but same activity, but accounting for it differently or tracking it, then in accounting, they got to train for all that. And that just can lead to gridlock, because when everything's a one-off, it just leads to a lot of time, and people don't understand, like, hey, just put the numbers in the boxes and tell me what the financials are. Well, if it was, it can be, but no other department, a lot of times the department of sales can make a sale, but how do you account for it? And someone can buy something, and it happens a lot now with credit cards and everything. Hey, we need something, we need it fast. Okay, they can buy that. You can get it. Comes in, but what job do we charge? What code do we charge? Did we even buy this? And so that creates accountant literally has got to go, if you got one person accounting, they got to go through every decision people made within a company every month.
It reminds me, oh, you're triggering me. It's so funny. I remember with memories of my parents. I was growing up doing their accounting, and I was doing a lot of the bookkeeping and back end stuff for them when I was literally 12, 13, 14 years old, just kind of evolved into it. Hey, I can add those things up. Sure, I can do that. And I remember specifically saying to my parents, stop spending like doing petty cash. I don't even like the term petty cash, but you're making me crazy because you've got all these cash withdrawals and we don't know what it accounts to. Like, how do what was it spent on? Mm-hmm. Another story was, I had a client of mine who was a contractor, and I remember I said to him, okay, so you want to grow your business and you need some help in doing that. Okay, got it. Well, let's look at your numbers. Let's look at your books. Well, I don't have that. Right? I don't have that information. We do it at the end of the year. We do it the next year for the last year. And I said, okay, well, we need to figure out those numbers. And I'll never forget it. He hires this bookkeeper. He says, oh, I got this girl. She's put all the information in. They send me the report. And, his business, I think he was in the second or third year of business or something like that. He's doing about 300,000. And no, I think it was more like it was 500. But then out of that, there was about, I think it was like $52,000 worth of uncategorized, don't know which job it goes to. And I'll never forget this. The bookkeeper, I said to her, what does this account, like, what does this relate to? Do you have any idea? And she said, no. She says, I don't. I have no idea. We can't figure that out. Would you like me to just remove it from the report? And I'm like, are you serious? No, that's not the solution. Sweep it under the carpet. That doesn't work real well. So anyway, that's the kind of thing where you come in and you start to develop some systems. But
and a lot of times people start their own businesses and may or may not have worked in bigger companies. But there's an inverse relationship between the speed of accounting information based off the size of a company. Some of the biggest companies close and have financial information in real time. And some of the smallest companies, it's the longest period. We just had the final tax deadline for last year, right? And there were some people who were probably just getting their information to their accountant, and that's 10 months after year end. And so there's a reason why big companies spend money so that they can have good financial information as soon as possible. And there are none that say, we'll wait 6 months.
Well, you can't do anything. I always say, what are we going to do if you're behind schedule, if you're off track? We can't make any impact on it if we don't know what's going on. And if you only tell me the after the fact, well,
And that's what happens is there's the shoulder shrug. Well, this is 2 months old. This is 6 months old. I can't do anything about it. And so it's almost like, well, I don't have to do anything about it. And the relevancy is down, and that helps to be in denial. Well, things are better now. Well, how do you know? I mean, that's kind of the essence feedback on how something's doing is seeing the financial results. That gives you a pretty good signal. And if you're ignoring it because it's an old signal, it's really useless.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you recommend? Let's start, maybe diving into that for the people that are listening who are going, oh, he's talking to me. I don't know what my books are. I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard people say, I have no idea how much money I made in my business, like entrepreneurs, right? Mm-hmm. They don't know how much money they made until after the fact, or didn't make until after the fact. And so they're running on perception that they're cash flowing, their business is cash flowing, not realizing until the end of the year or the few months later, they realize that they actually lost money. And so how do they prevent that? If they're in that situation, what do they do to rectify it?
First thing is talk to their CPA. Usually their CPA could help them just get a sense of what does this company need in terms of, is it a bookkeeper? Is it an accountant? Is it an accounting manager or controller? And that kind of gets into the ability of the person to make decisions, to organize information. You're talking about someone who's like, well, I put everything in and some doesn't fit in, so I'll hide it. And that's going to be lower on the spectrum. So your CPA can generally help you, and the smaller you are, oftentimes they can help you do those kind of services. Realize one of the first things is realize what your internal cost of time is. That if you waste a year doing something that's not productive, what's that cost to you? And you can break that down on an hourly basis, because if you're doing the accounting or trying to compensate for it, that gets expensive for a cost. An entrepreneur, could they make $150,000 at their opportunity cost per year? Well, if they're doing that kind of work that you could pay a third or less to on an hourly basis, you're already picking up time and you're not wasting your life. So understand there's a cost, and CPAs are a great first place to talk to.
Okay, great. And so they talk to them, they get things sorted out. You mentioned about a greater dysfunction that this is a symptom of. Can you talk a little bit more about what that reveals?
Yeah, I've cleaned up companies of all sizes, from a couple million revenues to hundreds of million revenues. And you can get your hands around the information. You can get it coded. You can see what activities they're making money on and what they're not. But what I found was none of these businesses that were confused, and sometimes they weren't even really losing money, they just could be making more, is they didn't when you talk to people individually on the team, they kind of had different opinions about what's most important in the business. Who's doing what? Who's our core customer? What's really important for us to be successful? And when there's differences, small, that shows up in the accounting, because it gets harder to do it when, well, our core customer is this, and I think our core customer is that, and so they're spending differently. But it shows up in that. And if it's a really diametrically opposed, it really shows up. That's when you have the companies that the meetings are really frustrating, because any issue kind of inevitably gets to, there's a bigger unanswered question. Like, if you really knew who your core customer was, it's not that hard to figure. It's easier to figure out how you're going to spend on marketing. But when you got multiple core customers, they're all most important, your marketing gets a lot more expensive. And when you're trying to figure out where you're going to spend your time and energy as your team, and you all have a disagreement about what the most important thing is, it's not only frustrating for the leader, it's frustrating for the people working for them and around them. So there's unanswered questions that often are there because you're not required to answer important questions. You're required to answer your phone when your customer's ringing, right? But in turn, it's never urgent. It's one of those things that's important, but rarely urgent.
So when you talk about confident ROI, then on the flip side, define confident ROI? Sure.
So after I would get the numbers done and get a sense, kind of get the patient stabilized, oftentimes there would be, okay, what's missing here and how can we improve this business? And there are so many business tools out there. I love them. There's ways to improve your business, from how to make more sales, how to market, how to hire better, train better, how to define your strategy, how to define your core principles and your values. It's like, it can give you a headache, right? Where do you start? And where can you select something confidently that you're going to get a return on investment? Because I'm sure people listening to the show, they've either seen something in a presentation, seen something on a podcast, been at an event and there was a speaker, and wow, they just totally nailed it. We need checklists at our front line, and that's totally what we need. There's a great book, Checklist Manifesto. But should you start there? Can you confidently say, hey, not only the money you'll spend, but the time, your time, other people's time, and your credibility? Hey, should we be implementing checklists? Maybe. They're a really good thing. However, when you're not really sure on who your core customer is and what you have to supply to them, you're going to have and you have multiple most important customers and most important services, you're going to have an exponential number of checklists. So defining those questions so you can confidently get to make a selection, that's where confident ROI comes from.
Well, it makes me think back to, I had a mentor, Dr. Robert Rome. He has a saying, he said, certain personalities which lend themselves to, they tend to be the D in the DISC model. They tend to be the drivers, the doer, decisive.
Right.
The CEOs, right? They're just like, they're moving it. And he said, you got to watch out for some of them, because they'll have this philosophy like, I'm lost, but I'm making good time. So, we're doing checklists, we're doing this, we're doing that. C personality types. I teach personalities, and I think it's really interesting not to categorize or box people in, but just noticing some of the tendencies of different personality types. And checklists and analysis and reports and all that's great, but if you don't know where you're going, and if you don't know that you're on track, which is what you're talking about, then you could be wasting a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of resources, to do that. You mentioned about sequencing. Another thing that I learned along the way, and in my own experience, is that there is a sequence to business. Like you said, there's so much information out there. If people want information and knowledge, it used to be knowledge is power. A lot of my guests recently have been saying, knowledge is not power, applied knowledge is power, and that's absolutely true, right? Knowledge in itself is just knowledge. It's just data. So it's not even understanding necessarily. It's just a whole bunch of information. So the biggest thing that I see right now, and that's what I'm hearing you say that you solve, is that there's so much information out there. Where do I start? There's a compelling speaker that says this, there's the webinar, and a lot of times people will say to me, what do I need to do? And the first thing is looking at, oftentimes, is what do they need to stop doing? Like, stop running half-cocked and doing all these different crazy things. You ask them what their marketing strategy is. It's like, wow, like shotgun, just all over the place. And the cost of that is ridiculous. And where's the ROI?
Well, there's a credibility cost, because people are like, oh, but here we go again.
Yes.
And one of the key you talked about,
that's credibility internally with the employees as well as externally.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The wheel spin, I call it, can often occur when, hey, let's try something. Let's throw something against the wall. And that can be high energy. Leaders can be that way. That gets to the fatal assumption that a lot of business tools make, that the leader is listening and sensing, okay, what's working? It's almost like, hey, are we getting traction here? If our wheels are spinning, do we let off a little bit? And they all assume that the leader's got a great relationship with feedback. All business improvement tools do, but that's not the reality. The reality is, hey, a lot of times, hey, activity means we're doing something. Not. And then you get to the sequence. Sequence was huge, and is huge from when I was writing my book and analyzing business improvement tools. I looked at the companies I had seen and helped them pick things. Everyone tends to start on the outside of their business, because that's where the pain point is. The customer's upset, the supplier's maybe upset, or the employees that are dealing with them. So it's easy to focus on the front lines, but the front lines are pretty wide versus stepping back and looking at the core. Why do we exist? What are we trying to do here? How is this company going to survive? Those questions come from the inside. It's counterintuitive when you're having trouble on the exterior business to step back and say, let's think about this. How's this company going to survive with our limited resources? As Toyota, in order to compete originally, didn't have the money for lots of parts. So it had to come up with a way that it could build cars with low capital. But that's a core decision. They couldn't make that on the interior. So sequence is huge, because when you know what your culture is, when you know why you exist, when you know, hey, this is how we think we can survive, now it's a lot easier to hire people versus, hey, we hired people, now let's try to let's get a culture that defines them, and let's get a survival strategy that defines them. It's backwards. And hey, we also, by the way, we bought a accounting system and an ERP system and a CRM system. Well, but does that match how we think we're going to survive, how we're going to survive, how we're going to convince people to buy our product in enough to make money? So most people start from the outside and work in, which makes it a lot harder. Then you have to reconcile important things versus starting from the inside out. So that's the sequence. And I talk about in my book, there's a way to help people within your company see what's next, because a lot of times they expect too, okay, we just defined our marketing strategy, we're done. No, you're not. Now that here's the next step and the next step and the next step. And so they can see it, and that because our brains want to be done. It's the way we're wired. Once we're rewired, it takes a lot of energy to rewire and think about things. So we want to be done as soon as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, let's get this over with. I hear that, it's like, just get it over with. I just want to move on and grow the business, or I want to focus on this area. Yeah. And what you're saying is we got to step back for a moment. And now your book, you talk a lot about tools, business tools that are not found elsewhere. I'm curious, what are some of those tools that you either utilize or that you developed in order to help companies, because your book is called Transform Your Company, to help them to actually transform. What are you transforming? We talk a little bit about it here, but specifically what you're transforming and how you're transforming it.
Well, it's great to be talking about it on the Leaders of Transformation show. So
that's what we're about here.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're transforming is trying to take the dysfunction out. And so we talked earlier about the symptoms. And so dysfunction, from what I've seen, comes from people not having different answers to important questions. And I look at, what are the tools out there? Because I was recommending a tool to one of my customers. It was EOS Traction years ago. And they asked me, well, how do I know it's the best one? And are there any other ones? And there wasn't a name for those tools at the time. It was kind of EOS Traction, and eMyth is for smaller companies, but it's similar in terms of it answers important questions from the core all the way out to outside to the exterior of your company. And so I gave it a name, Business Alignment Tools, because they help get people aligned. But then I call them, then all those individual tools that are out there, I name them. They're bolt-on tools, where like a checklist, manifesto, that's a bolt-on tool. And that really kind of giving people a sense of what's the order and what's the sequence in that, and what's the number one thing that they all assume. They all assume that the leader's got a good relationship with feedback. If they implement a new marketing program and they're using Infusionsoft, they're going to be looking to see, hey, is it working? Versus, oh, we're not getting the results we want. Something's wrong with Infusionsoft. Versus, hey, is there something wrong with our offer, how we're presenting it? That feedback is so critical. EOS Traction, Scaling Up, eMyth, they all assume the business leader is going to be looking and saying, hey, is it working? If it's not working, what do we need to adjust? People, pricing, product, positioning within the marketplace. And I tell people, if you don't have a good relationship with feedback, don't waste your money on any of these things, because they all assume you're going to do that. And a lot of coaches think that they can improve someone's relationship with feedback. But the way we're wired, I've had a neuroscientist on my show, and he confirmed we are wired to ignore feedback that doesn't match our view of the world. And a lot of entrepreneurs have Steve Jobs, had his view of the world, and he was able to bend it. But we're wired not to take in information that doesn't match what we hear, because it's easier on the brain.
Yeah. Well, and if you don't know the ROI, pun intended, if you don't know the ROI, then why are you even going to do it? Right. So because you're focused on, if you're the CEO and you're saying, look, don't bother me with talking about the CRM system, figure it out. and not realizing. Now, well, you talked about the alignment, though. These tools that alignment tools, bolt-on tools. I love that, right? They're bolted on. So when you do when you have the alignment tools in place, then in that process, do you have a tool for for feedback, right? So that they can actually reframe the way that they look at feedback to start to embrace it, rather than just saying, well, they don't like it. And I know that's not what you're saying. I know, but that's the natural tendency.
It's part of what I'm saying is one of the things with the ROI is like, well, what's our ROI going to be? One of the things about business improvement tools, it's similar to improving your golf game or whatever sport you play. You can't buy a better golf swing or a lower golf score. You can buy instruction, but you actually have to go and implement it and use the feedback and work at it and practice at it. There's nobody offering, hey, I can make you a 0 handicap in this. Nobody can offer that. And that's where all of these tools, are you committed to getting better at it? You can't just get that ROI. The ROI comes from within. And once you have that, but then finding out how do you handle feedback? And in the book, I ask them, hey, think about how you handle it when things don't go according to plan. Project's late, over budget, customers upset. How do you handle it? Do you have a good relationship? You're trying to get to the understanding of something. If you look at Jim Collins' work on Good to Great, basically there were a bunch of leaders that had a really healthy relationship with feedback, which is not the default state for the brain. And so are you asking good questions? Is what basically his books say, is they were leaders that asked great questions. Or are you just making statements like, oh, that's the market, or a competitor plays dirty? If you're doing statements, you're not really trying to dig in. And so finding out, and I ask them to pay attention and as things come up, but then I ask people around you. How do I handle it? How do I handle feedback? Do I try to find what's true, or do I try to just to move on? And I leave them with the litmus test of ask your spouse. Is your spouse your spouse might ask you, do you really want to know? That's what my wife does. When I ask her something, I know I'm going to like the answer, she's always like, do you really want to know? And because it can save everyone a lot of time. And there's nothing like an ROI of, hey, not spending $50,000 on something when you're not set up to succeed at it. That's a good ROI.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned about Infusionsoft, and that's a tool that a lot of people who have been in seminars and they've heard somebody promote Infusionsoft, and they're like, oh, I need to have that. That compelling sales presentation was, just like, I got to have it. And then I don't know how many times, and it is a great tool. I had it for years, and yet it's not the right tool for everybody, depending on where they're at and are they willing to use it. It's a good example. If they're not willing to utilize all that it has, then it's not really a good ROI for the investment. You can get something else that'll do what you need if you're not going to use it properly. This is great. Now, I know one of the key questions that you address is, how do I find my starting line as a leader? So before we wrap up, I want to make sure we cover that, because it's an important subject.
Sure. The real starting line is how a leader handles feedback. It's between their ears. That's the real starting line. And when I discovered this, as I was doing my work on the book and reflecting on my experiences and interviewing coaches and that, it was, how did people handle feedback? And I had an image inside there between your ears, but talking with the neuroscientists afterwards and how neuroscience, they're applying it within leadership and business now, it's really physically there, and how to understand your relationship with feedback. And you might verify where it's at. And if you can verify, hey, I got a good relationship with feedback and people around me who can be honest with me, verify that, great. But understand that's the smallest segment of the population, where most business improvement tools all assume you have a good one. They just make the assumption like, hey, it's logical. If you're not getting the results in a marketing campaign, you're going to change it. Well, that's not the reality. And so, but if you have a poor relationship with feedback, that's okay, as long as you're aware of it and you figure out a way to adjust that people, they can, depends on the severity of it. If you're kind of like, well, you kind of don't like to hear the truth. All right, I want to work on that. Versus you got people so scared in your organization, they're not going to bring anything up. And it's a lot of times just easier for them, like, because they got to risk, changing schools for their kid if they upset you, right? So it's a lot easier to go, I'm not going to tell you the product's not what you think it is. And so if you can find out that that's your real starting line, and then you might not be as frustrated with a lot of things you've tried, like, hey, maybe that's why those things haven't worked. And where I can really start is within. The real starting line's within. Not necessarily fixing people in the company, but fixing how you handle the feedback of the company.
Yeah. Well, we've kind of started off going to the end and then coming backwards and really at that starting line. So getting feedback, knowing where you're at in terms of getting feedback, how receptive you are, and then working on that based on, on what that starting line is. I think, if you were to build a culture of feedback, if your people are afraid to give feedback, it's probably because the leader is and uncomfortable with feedback as well. And I had a guest recently, we were talking about that, asking questions and even just getting feedback on the type of leader that you are. When you start asking other people for that feedback, then you're actually building that culture where they're going to be much more comfortable if you have feedback to give them when that time comes. And so really, really important stuff. So people can find out more about, so it's confidentroi.com is the website. They can get your book, Transform Your Company, which goes through these business tools and unpacks it for them. You have your podcast, Confident ROI Podcast. And great branding, by the way, for those of you watching the video. He's all branded up. It's awesome. And you have your Confident ROI magazine.
The magazine.
So,
actually, the magazine came first, and I was doing interviews with business leaders about which business tools were working for them. And I remember one was so emotional because they'd gone from almost defaulting on their bank loan to hitting their stretch goal in 12 months. And they were describing it. I'm like, how am I going to write this? So that's the podcast actually came second.
Wow. And what a great testimony to this. I mean, we've talked conceptually, intellectually about this, but when you talk about that shift, that transformation that happens and the impact that has on the leader, on every single person in the organization, the spouses you talked about, your wife, and if you have a spouse that is working within a company or owns a company that is not healthy, that can create a lot of stress for you as well.
That's why I dedicate the book to spouses of people who work in dysfunctional companies, because they get the worst of it.
Yeah.
They're not there, and they got to hear about it, and their partner. That when I talk about transforming a company, it's about taking the dysfunction out to liberate people within the company, because it's not something you can just let go, because you're also reminded of it on your phone when you get an email or a text that there's a problem. That's a sign. It's a symptom of dysfunction. And the millennials, they don't like it. They're out. And not only are they out, they're not gonna give you 2 weeks. They'll just text you no, this ain't gonna work for me anymore. And so it's hard to keep almost every industry is facing labor supply issues. And so figuring that out before people walk out is essential.
Figure it out before they walk out. There you go. It's
Don King in me.
Yeah, there you go. Alex, I really appreciate you coming on, and there's so much more to unpack. I know the details, there's lots of things, but when you talk about from an overriding understanding the root cause and then working from there, I think is so impactful. And as a CPA, recognizing that is huge, rather than just saying, focusing on costs. How do we cut costs? How do we do, you're looking at it from a bigger picture. So you bring both of these skill sets and understanding and perspectives to working with your clients, which I think is really critical. So thanks for being here, sharing a little bit of that with us.
Well, thanks
today.
for having me on, Nicole. And it's been great being on Leaders of Transformation with, talk about the book, Transform Your Company.
Yes, absolutely. And for our listeners out there, I always say at the end of every episode, make sure that you take action on something that you heard today. You may say, my company is doing just fine, thank you, I think. We know at the end of the year, we know, maybe your company is doing really great, and that's fantastic. And maybe it's taking it to that next level, improving the level of feedback that you're getting so that you can increase your ROI. Or maybe your company's in a situation where you've been focusing so much on making an impact out there, following your mission, that maybe the finances and the accounting and all that kind of stuff has kind of fell by the wayside. Or you're trying to do it yourself, well beyond, it's just not a good return on your time investment, because you're meant to be doing other things. Whatever it is, whatever situation you're in, I think there's some value here that you can take, and you can take action on it. So start somewhere. Start with, what's your starting line? Where are you beginning this process? What's the end game? What are you looking to create? Maybe it's aligning and looking at your business tools and saying, what's not efficient? What are we using that we just aren't even utilizing properly, or we don't even know what the ROI is? There's so much here, and I encourage you to take action on it, something today, not next month, not next year. Don't table it for the strategy session that you've got planned for whenever, someday in the future, but take action on it today, because that's when transformation happens, is when you begin to apply the knowledge that you get. So I encourage you that. We look forward to hearing your stories. You can go on confidentroi.com and connect with Alex, his magazine, his podcast, his book. It's all there. Also, that will all be on leadersoftransformation.com. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you another episode of Leaders of Transformation real soon.